Jacksonville. Things would be so easy if he could take the homeless or the hookers, but they would have the detestable flavor of the one who tried to attack him in Boston, and they would degrade him. Just as most people would, he sensed healthy men and women in their mid-20s were ideal. They gradually went stale after that, and before that, their energy lasted a shorter time and was less strong. But he had to be very careful not to hunt the same type all the time. He must avoid patterns. Jacksonville seemed to be a good place to start again. He got a job the legitimate way, with his real fake identification, even though he knew it would cause some little light to illuminate somewhere in the bowels of the IRS, either on a computer screen, in an algorithm, or in someone's brain. It would bring forth some little indication that he existed, and it would lie in wait until it was sought by someone with ill intent. His alternative would be to work illegally, but that would make him stand out even more. He was tall and white, with dirty blonde hair and pale blue eyes like a Malamute. He would have to hide in the open. How infuriated he was with such tight reins. He had a plan, however. His father had discussed with him that he would need a new fake identity someday. Spirit Sower had even gotten a few for himself over the years. His intelligence mastered his passions, and he knew that to survive he would have to bow to the force of society. The one Matthew had should have lasted 50 or 60 years before covering his age was impossible, but now he would have to make that happen sooner. First, he would have to disappear, and for that, he would need money. He had learned quickly that money makes any plan easier. He would start by saving as much as he could, and he would find a job that would pay more by the hour. In Jacksonville, he again slept outside and got a job with a landscaping company. Some of the workers were illegal. He was hired so that the boss could use his legal status to prove his business was legitimate. He earned a little more because of that. And every penny that he earned, he converted into $100 bills, and he kept them in his backpack. And his backpack he kept close. He kept his soul-taking to a measured pace, and everything went well. He was getting smoother, and the people just disappeared and were never heard from again. There were no big news stories, no big searches, and he was at peace in Jacksonville for 3 years before he moved along. He came and went like a tumbleweed. Wanderlust. He spent 5 years wandering. He walked, hitchhiked, and slept outside. He had no fear of being robbed. If anyone tried to attack him, he could fast walk or strike. Fast walking worked best because people always looked away from him, even for a second, and when they turned back, he would be gone. He learned a joke that he told people who were in his grip, but only the ones who had tried to rob him, or, in 2 cases, kill him. A man is hitchhiking, he said, and he gets picked up. He says to the guy, "Aren't you nervous picking up a hitchhiker? I could be a serial killer." And the driver says, "Yeah, but what are the chances of 2 serial killers being in the same car?" But that was only for his enemies. Normal victims he put down before they knew what hit him. He learned more about what made a strong spirit. They came from those who had strong will. That could be a person with friends or a lonely person, but usually a person with friends. They had charisma that drew energy from others, and it accumulated. It did not always correspond with good or bad people, although bad people sometimes polluted their souls with spite or hatred. And some good people gave too much of their energy away and were taken advantage of. The best ones had an abiding confidence, and he could often see it in their walk. Thus, the best souls were more difficult to obtain. They had more connections, they had more responsibilities, and they often had more money. That meant they would be missed, which meant they were a more dangerous catch. Matthew had a great weapon against them, however: patience. He could stalk them one after the other and only make his move every 100th time and still have plenty to feed on. Also, he developed his own charisma by using the gathering of power as he prepared to strike. He learned to conjure it up just a little, just enough to make them awestruck and unsure. Matthew's presence took on a weight and power that few men possessed, and they came under his spell. They were not zombies, but they were more suggestible and more trusting. It was better to sneak up on people, to lurk nearby until they were alone, but if needed, he could use this charm to convince them to come with him to a remote place. More important than that, if he were seen glowering at someone from a dark corner, he was able to talk his way out of it. He could turn it into a joke, or he would apologize, whatever lowered their apprehension. He would make friends easily with people, and they would never suspect that someone like him, tall, good-looking, and confident, could harbor such intentions. It was dangerous to work this way. Someone could potentially remember that he was there. So when he did this, he would have to keep moving on and keep his life subtle. He was reminded of the importance of moving as he passed into Texas. He took the soul of a driver with a flat tire. He changed the wheel and drove the car some distance away from the road into the desert. The radio was on. He never cared what was on the radio, but someone was giving an interview, and he was talking about disappearances. He talked about a girl who had gone down to a lake to take pictures and was never seen again. All they ever found was the lens cap to her camera. She was not far away, and only could have been out of sight for a few moments. Spirit Wolf had not done this. And there were more stories, one after the other. He listened all the way to the end of the program. The disappearances had many similar characteristics and formed patterns. Many sounded like Matthew's doings, although none were. People were often found without shoes. Often there was bad weather involved. Matthew himself sometimes chose days where rain or snow was coming because it hampered search efforts and erased evidence. The people were most often alone, and they often had high intelligence and were in the prime of their lives. Spirit Wolf's brothers were out there. He thought some of them must have gone to other countries. In fact, he was sure they had. He had thought about doing so himself. But some of them, maybe only one of them, who knew, had been out there in America, near where Matthew had been. The stories were mostly from national parks, but a few were from cities, as if the person had recently started to suspect that cities were part of the same pattern. When he talked about them, he mentioned the smiley faces near some victims, and Spirit Wolf's eyes dilated with interest. The investigator was out there, and he was hunting. Dallas. He became a waiter in Dallas. This was because, with his power of charm, he would make more than he would robbing people. Customers felt a connection to him. They felt he was a friend, and that he would keep their confidence. He had a way of drawing out their inner feelings in insightful ways. They often called them revelations. What they didn't know was that he was just putting their meaningless thoughts and anecdotes in a context that sounded significant. They would add in details to make his story make more sense, which made them think they had a deep connection. He built stories from the fragmented details about their lives as easily as a child would build a house from a pile of wood blocks. But they saw an edifice of meaning and telos, and they expressed their gratitude with exorbitant tips. These are the things he learned in Dallas. He also tried to learn how to knock someone out without killing them. He wanted a finer control of his power, and he viewed the small power gathering he did to mesmerize people as the bottom of a pillar of strength, with striking at the top of the pillar. He wanted to control the middle and then the whole continuum of power. The bottom was a warm smile. The top was a sledgehammer. This went against the will of the power. It was designed to kill, not harm. He could feel it resist him as he tried to resist it. He first thought using it on small animals would help him temper it. He bought from a scientific supply store a few mice and struck them as lightly as he could, but they always puffed up and rolled over, about to burst. So he tried it on squirrels, which he could do at a park. They all died as well, although some managed to scamper up a tree before falling to the ground. But those were the unlucky ones. They squealed pitifully, and blood came out of their eyes. He did not use it on cats or dogs, because the owners would be angry and determined, like the parents of the Dartmouth girl. He managed to find some strays, though, and they died. If he struck a cow, it would usually die, but sometimes he could hold himself back, and it would wander around bewildered for a few minutes before it came back to its senses. But with people, as soon as he started to release the power of the strike, there was no holding it back. It always flowed out with full vigor and struck them dead. It was as if it overwhelmed his mind and he could not think for a few seconds. And then it was done. First date. Don't you want to get to know me a little better? She stroked his hand lightly as she said that. Matthew would laugh at himself for years because of this. That's what it took to get through to him. Matthew only understood himself as a hunter and a survivor. Girlfriends were a theory, not something real. It was as if the touch of her hand was like how his father stood shoulder to shoulder on his first strike. Suddenly, he knew. Yes, he said, let's do that. Definitely. They went at the end of their shift to a bar, and he realized there that he knew Natty much better than he thought. They got pleasantly tipsy, and they went to her apartment, where they talked and cuddled and went further. But Natty insisted on showering. Matthew didn't understand. After a full night's work at Lucia, said Natty, that's gross. We're covered in restaurant. The next day, Matthew's head was on sideways. He had had no idea what it was like. He had never thought about his age, not that he could remember it anymore, but it was something like 40. That was unusual for a normal person, he knew, but that didn't matter. He would live for centuries, probably. But now he had a whole new perspective on life. They met again and again after work and on their days off. He was going to marry her. He was sure of it. Already his money had grown. She did not know his capacity, but he had a lot in his backpack. But soon it was over. Why not your place, she said. He remembered that moment later on, the moment he should have answered differently. Of course, he said. She would be impressed with him. She would see how he saved his money, how he did not need the consumer items of the average man. It could be their perfect nest. They took a cab across 35E to St. Marcellus Avenue. He had the cabbie park on Opera Street, and they walked to Cedar Creek under the bridge. She asked why they had to walk, and he said, just hold on, you'll love it. They went down the slope to the creek, and he showed her his house. It was well hidden. She looked at it in silence. Then, glancing at him twice, she said, This? I don't even need it. I just have it so the others will think I'm normal. Come in, he said, pulling her hand. She pulled back. This is a plywood, I don't know what it is, lean-to. Yes. I don't need all the conveniences of modern people. It's ultra-minimalist. His smile faded. This is crazy, Matthew. Come in, you'll see. I think I need to go home. Home? But don't you understand? Yes, Matthew, it's fine. I just feel a little dizzy for some reason. I think I didn't sleep well last night. I'm sorry, I really have to go. Okay, I'll take you back. No, that's okay. I'll get my own cab. She took her cell phone out and turned away and went back to the road and wouldn't talk to him. And the next day at work, she said they were not right for each other, and they talked, and she could not be convinced. Matthew left that night. New Orleans and his first time. Matthew thought about her much as he wandered again in the wilderness. How could you do that? He said out loud. He slept on the ground. But he learned two other things in Dallas that were not as obvious. The moment of joy, that's what he called it, when he was with Natty, was something he could not control. Once the feeling took over, it overwhelmed him and could not be stopped. In that respect, it was like striking someone. It was the opposite in every other way. It was somehow giving life energy rather than taking it. But once he had raised his hand and started to strike, there was no holding back the energy. It came from too deep within. He also learned that the money in his pack was small. He had looked at houses that he would buy Natalie, and his backpack could not defeat any of them. Its count seemed large in person, but its total was not enough for a house. And he learned that inflation chipped its value away. He felt like a fool thinking of money. He was a hunter. He was a master. And he was half a god. How could he lower himself to think of money? But he realized that Dracula was much like him. He had always felt they were somewhat alike, but that also made him realize that even figures like Dracula had to think about money. Dracula wouldn't consider inflation or how he would have to invest his money to build up a return. But even he had ancestors with peasants who paid them money, and the accounts would have to show a profit, and he would have to maintain it somehow. That's the only way he could have his great dark castle. Matthew might not need a castle, but if he were to make a woman happy, he could not live in a shack and stuff bills into an old backpack, not even if it had $1 million in it. Thus, when he settled in New Orleans, he lived on the street as usual, and he worked as a waiter again, but he learned to put money in the stock market, index funds. He was embarrassed for the first time in his life when he went in to talk to someone about it, and his reception was strange. No one had ever come in with a backpack full of money to invest. But their demeanor changed completely when they saw how much it was. Suddenly, he was a king, and they were his serfs. And so his feelings improved. He had all the time he needed to let his money grow, and he learned that Dracula was not a kindred spirit just for the obvious reasons. They were alike also in the fact that they both relied. Still, he cringed every time he thought the words. They both relied on sound financial planning. He got a P.O. box and a bank account and everything else and tried to forget it. He went through one girlfriend after another, now that he knew what it was like. He never planned to keep one more than a month or two, although in practice, sometimes it lasted longer. He only went to their apartments and broke it off as soon as they started asking questions. What he learned was how to restrain himself. It was not easy, but he learned to control it, even in the moment of joy. And then he learned to apply that same restraint to his strikes. And with time, he was able to strike people, either so that they were bewildered like the cows, or so that they were knocked out but not dead. He couldn't control it perfectly yet, but he was close. For victims, he got them much the same way he did in Boston. With an endless supply of bars, there was never a shortage of people to follow. The higher murder rate in New Orleans only helped him. But eventually, strange deaths started to be noticed. He saw reporters connecting dots, and he thought back to that radio program. Whoever that was would find their stories eventually. So after 3 years, he had to go. Wilderness. He wandered without a map to he knew not where. He did not want to know. He only wanted to follow trees and empty places. His victims were hikers and hunters, and he worked to hone his powers to a fine skill. One woman who had stopped to get water and add iodine to it while her friends set up camp saw him across the stream and said hi. And instead of raising his hand, he stared at her, and she stood, and then she dropped her bottle and stared again. "Come across the water," he said. She walked, eyes fixed on his. Soon she slipped. She got up on all fours, but just stared at him. Matthew light-walked toward her. "Rise," he said. She stood up. "Walk." He backed away from her, and she followed him again and fell. And he took her by the neck and cracked her head into a rock so she was unconscious and fell into the water. He went into the woods and waited until her friends came to look for her and found her dead. And that was when he knew he had perfected his power. He could do something his father could not. "Do you see, Spirit Sower?" he said triumphantly into the wilderness. He light-walked into the forest and went miles and miles, and the next day he sat atop a mountain, and a group of hikers came and said hello to him and asked him his name, and he knew he could make them all hurl themselves from a cliff. And they left, and he light-walked over peaks and valleys, and in the dusk there was a boy who had walked into the woods to see the sunset as his family cooked their food, and without even thinking, and in the intoxication of power, Matthew struck him. The soul offered little energy. He looked at the small body, blown out of its shoes. "Why did I do it?" he asked himself. "I knew there would be little to gain." He was sure there would be a thorough search for the boy. Though he had never struck a child, he knew that he would not simply be forgotten. It would be like the Dartmouth girl. Matthew flushed with embarrassment. How could I be so stupid? He picked up the body and light-walked it many miles away and put it in a crevice high on a mountain that only a rock climber could reach, and he piled rocks and sticks on it and fled.